Well, welcome to the St. Macrina seminar on St. Maximus the Confessor's book on the ecclesiastical mystagogy. I'm delighted that Andrew Bingham is leading us in this conversation and engagement with St. Maximus's work. Just one note about Andrew. Andrew did his doctoral work at Queen's University, looking at literature and also at the Christian East. So he has a very developed understanding of these matters. We've also had the pleasure over the last 3 years of reading through Maximus's work together in a small little study group. So I'm delighted that he's going to walk us into this particular work of Maximus. One other note, Maximus is a monk. He is writing for monks. He's writing in that context of that tradition that had developed over 7 centuries. And because he's a monk and writing for monks, he has a very sophisticated intellectual understanding, but it's constantly anchored, constantly comes back to the spiritual life and to helping the reader think more deeply about how they can draw near to God. So there's an intimacy in it. That's the disposition that's there. And I mention that solely because it is it's sort of central to understanding him and walking into it. And it is a bit different than some of the kind of theological intellectual formation that has certainly influenced my early life. So I mentioned that to you. We're delighted that each of you have joined and look forward to our conversation with you. Andrew.
Thank you, David. Yes, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and a real joy to be able to join in conversation, especially around something as beautiful and profound as this work by Maximus. This is a 5-session seminar. We are reading this volume, as David said, on the ecclesiastical mystagogy. The work is also found in this volume, the Maximus Confessor volume of Plastics of Western Spirituality, with a slightly more stately tone in the translation. Please have this work on hand or nearby, if you can, during the seminar, because we'll be reading aloud from it and returning to it and folks dwelling with it continually. Now, the seminar overall was meant to kind of follow 3 questions. First, how is the language of being appropriate to God? This is the global sense of the seminar that we put on the poster. Second, how are symbol, metaphor, and transcendence composed in the liturgy? And then third, what is Maximus's vision of the mystery at the hearts of the church? So that's the overall framework. Each day we're going to have 2 or 3 themes and 2 or 3 questions, which are meant to be linked with the themes and with the readings, hopefully to deepen our sense of these ideas and these matters. The themes today are one's own. First is one's own, or what is appropriate? What is one's own or our own? These are in the chat too, written down. Second, the theme of gathering or concentration. Gathering or concentration. And the third theme is phrasing meaning. Phrasing meaning. So we have one's own, or what is appropriate. And then we have gathering, concentration, and then phrasing meaning. And the questions that we'll ask, which I hope tie in with these towards the end, are, and these are in the chat as well now. First, what is Maximus's sense of living tradition? What does living tradition mean here? Second, what is meant by gathering? How do we understand gathering? And then third, why does Maximus invoke parameters of languages of being and non-being? So the questions: what is Maximus' sense of living tradition? Not just tradition, but living tradition. What does gathering mean? What's the essence of gathering, or the horizon of gathering? And why does Maximus invoke parameters of the languages of being and non-being? We'll deepen and open up those questions at the end, but so we can have them in mind as we're working through these notes. Now, each seminar will be the same. There'll be some opening remarks, and then we will focus on the text and then begin to talk with each other. Right? So, opening up the text. This is Maximus's work on the great mystery of the church. The great mystery of the church, or we could say the cosmic meaning of liturgy. The word cosmic is often linked with Maximus's name, for better or worse. So this essay, which is extraordinarily beautiful and extraordinarily dense, is about the great mystery of the church, or the cosmic meaning of the liturgy. On page 24 of the, you don't have to turn there, but on page 24 of the introduction, the translator kind of gives a breakdown of the sections of his work, and it can be useful. It's the most useful part of the introduction. It can be useful to refer back to page 24 just when we want to think, oh, where are we in the structure of the whole thing? This volume, this particular translated volume, was chosen because it has the Greek alongside it. And it's always best if you have the thing, the language, the original language, and then your own language as closely paired as possible so they can play together. Having the Greek is good, and yet we can note a couple of things about the translator just to keep in mind. The translators use a sometimes overly casual tone or overly casual diction to render Maximus's language. And this comes through because once one reads multiple translations of Maximus, one begins to recognize his phrasing. So on the one hand, he makes Maximus sound more casual than Maximus is sometimes. Also, there's this issue of the logos. The logos is probably the central term of this work. And the translators explain to us that they will not use it as logos because it's not common to us. Now, when one begins to involve one's own interpretation in translating logos this way or that way, then one begins to project onto the text a little bit more than necessary. And one loses the sense of the kind of unifying theme or refrain in the text, logos. So we have to listen, as it were, beyond the English sometimes. So they don't use the word logos, but they do use the words intelligible and sensible, for example, which are not common English words. Intelligible means of the intellect. It means noetic. It means sense-making. Sensible means aesthetic. of sensation. Intelligible and sensible in contemporary English mean different kind of, not as careful things as things. But when we read sensible, we can read aesthetic. And when we read intelligible, we can read noetic. Nonetheless, translation issues aside, and there are more, but we'll come to them. With Maximus, we are in masterful hands, masterful hands. Reading Maximus is an endless delight. It's a very odd delight too, because he always is out in front of us, always dancing. He doesn't seem exhaustible. And he seems to be able to seamlessly hold together in a completely astonishing way the elements of our faith and the ultimates of the church's mystery, almost with ease, or at least that's the sensation. Now, our approach to this work, our scope is not going to be historical. We're not going to look at Maximus's writing on the liturgy in terms of the history of the liturgy. That's beyond our purposes. Nor will it be formal. We're not going to look at Maximus's writing in light of, say, formal changes or the given form of his time. We're not looking at the schema of it. Rather, we're searching for the theological communication of divine meaning. It's theological, theologos, the holy word, the word of God, where we are. So it's the kind of theological vision, the theology of the liturgy. That's our focus. And because of this, we're not going to approach in a spirit of criticism, looking to catch him out or prove him wrong or prove us right or someone else wrong. And we're not going to approach certainty. Rather, following Maximus's own directives, we'll approach the text with reverence and in humility, with reverence for the mystery that he is phrasing for us, and in humility in that we are learning too. He's casting himself as a learner here. We're learning too. We're in that vein, but following him. Now, the work is a mystagogy, which means initiation into a mystery. Initiation into a mystery. And in the introduction, this is another helpful bit of the introduction. The translator outlines different kind of approaches to mystagogy in the early church. And some were historical, some were analogous, some were narrative. Maximus is distinguished by being, we call cosmic, or of the one whole. He's looking for the meaning of the one whole, of which we are a part. The communication of mystagogy is meant to be quiet, at least for Maximus. He begins by almost taking a step back. Initiation into a mystery like this is intimate. It's quiet. It's memorable. And on the very first page, let's turn there. It's page 46. We'll read just a little paragraph where Maximus says, this is how it kind of should be, but this is what we're going to do to help us. This is 5 lines down from the top of page 46, beginning you once. He's referring to Lord Theocharistos, his addressing. You once listened to me relating in a cursory and summary fashion, such as it was, the contemplations of another esteemed elder, who is truly wise in divine things concerning both the Holy Church and the divine synaxis that is performed in her. Since the contemplations were beautiful and mystical, note that, beautiful and mystical, and above all, valuable for teaching, you pleaded with me to draft for you a written exposition of these rights from the Synaxis. You wished to have this book as a remedy against forgetfulness and an aid to memory, saying that time naturally overpowers the memory and can imperceptibly, through forgetfulness, strip away and even completely obliterates the impressions and images of the beautiful things that are stored in the memory. For this reason, memory doubtless stands in need of a way of renewal by which the power of the written word continually abounds and by nature preserves the memory unchanged and undiminished. Everyone who is endowed with a little of the nobility of reason and is not completely estranged from intimacy with the word, surely knows how much wiser it is to hear, rather, to seek the indestructible permanence of that which is heard, rather than simply to hear. The written form of this, in other words, is a helping hand. It's not quite what would be best, but given the situation, it is expedient. Mystagogy is not just initiation and done, though, right? The horizon of this form, mystagogy draws one continually deeper into the mystery. It draws us continually deeper, Maximus continually deeper, his hearer continually deeper. It's not a kind of place at which one arrives and then sets everything down and is fine. It's endlessly ongoing because it is part of a living tradition. What does living tradition mean? Living tradition means we partake of something meaningful, larger than our own self. We partake of something meaningful, larger than our own. This means, too, that we are participating in something that means more than we can comprehend. We can't comprehend its meaning. We're taking part in it, but its meaning is not comprehensible, encompassable by us. It's larger than us. And the truths or the mysteries of a living tradition are conveyed by practitioners, by those who have become experienced and disciplined and have, struggled long. Here, Maximus phrases it in terms of an elder. Sometimes it's a friend or a brother. Here it's in terms of an elder. And Maximus says, this mystery that I'm communicating is conveyed intimately and quietly, and only when asked, not for me, not just because. It's to help or shared out of love. And we see this on, just turn to page 48, please, another brief example. This paragraph in which Maximus refers to St. Dionysius the Areopagite, one of his masters. This is page 48, beginning on the first full paragraph. Since the symbols, according to the sacred rites of the Holy Synaxis, have been contemplated by the all-holy and truly God-revealing Dionysius the Areopagite, in a fashion worthy of his expansive mind, in his treatise on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, one should know that the present discourse does not cover the same thing, nor does it advance through the same things as his. For, here's an important, for it would be audacity and arrogance and near insanity for those who are not able to attain to or to comprehend him, to attempt to emulate him, and to present as their own the mysteries that were revealed by inspiration through the Spirit to that one alone, to present as their own the mysteries that were revealed by the inspiration through the Spirit to that one alone, But the present discourse, Maximus's own work, covers as many things as are attainable to others, and as in the benevolent will of God, he omitted for the displaying and training of their habit concerning divine things according to their desire. Maximus wouldn't fulfill this request if, he's saying, if Dionysius had already given it to us. The living tradition is living because we partake of it, not because we each try to cast it or articulate it in our own terms, in our own time. We partake of something larger than this. And this mystery or this truth of Christianity is, it begins in gathering. Christ says, when two or three are gathered in his name, truth begins. He is with us. So I want to just think about gathering for a moment as the beginning of meaning and the beginning of liturgy too. How does tradition gather? Tradition gathers our forms of meaning. How does the divine liturgy gather? That's precisely what Maximus is talking about. The divine liturgy gathers by holding creation as one unto our God. How does an elder gather? The elder gathers the wisdom of tradition and holds it lightly and beautifully in a way that we don't know how, so that we can dance with them. But like Maximus says here, unless a truth is of one's own, one may not speak of it. So we have to have a gathering of our own too. A gathering of our own. And what does that mean to gather our own? It means to seek to live and to embody Christian truth. Gather our own truth, which is Christian truth. Now, the question of our own, what does our own mean? One's own, our own. It's also linked with the word proper, which means its own, and appropriate, which means of its own. But one's own, the question of one's own is the question of the significance of our existence, probably, our incarnate existence. The question of our own is also how we as person, as me, as you, belong in truth. How we belong in truth. Now, in the Christian tradition, our own, the blessing of personhood, of human being, is in God's own image. So our own is understood to also mean his own. Or, in language of the liturgy, mine own also turns into thine own, and indeed thine own of thine own. So one's own is linked with his own. We will continue with this throughout the seminar. And mine own also means his own. And so when we are gathering unto our own, trying to draw near to the truth of creatureliness, we're also drawing near, gathering unto his own, the truth of the Creator in our own. When we draw near to each other in love, we are drawing near to Christ, in other words. When we're honest with ourselves, we are honest with Christ as well. There's another kind of gathering, which is concentration. So we can think of gathering our own in terms of our whole person, but we can also think of concentration, meaning how the mind is gathered unto its own integrity, right? How the mind gathers itself for struggle or for effort. But that also means how the mind or the nous or the intellect is gathered unto his own, how it draws near, how it becomes intimate with his own, with the divine. Maximus's concentration is completely beautiful. And it's astonishing. When we were thinking about how to approach this volume, we thought we could set forth a schema, lay it out, first this, then he says this, he relates this section to this section because it follows from it, and look at the kind of greater logic of it. That's quite daunting in this short of a period of time. But one of the astonishing things about reading Maximus is that because his concentration is so superb, you can pick almost any sentence or phrase or paragraph and understand a good deal of the ethos of his whole thoughts. So it's not so important what you read in him, it's how well you read him. And he indicates this mystery when he's referring to his own blessed elder. This is on the bottom of page 49, please. He's talking about the elder that he refers to as his authority throughout this work. It's the last 5 lines on page 49. Last 5 lines. The discourse, Maximus is talking about his elder. The discourse succeeds in conveying and saying things so that his hearers are able to see the whole thoughts communicated in the discourse, and that all the things that he perceived are reflected purely in the whole thoughts and ferried across through the mediation of the discourse. Maximus's concentration, his thinking, is integral. It's throughout. It doesn't have peaks and valleys. It's not sometimes on and sometimes off. It's a constant attentiveness to the loving meaning of creation in which we flourish. And because Maximus's own is also Christ's own, I think that the truth of Maximus shines through insofar as his own soul, his own being, has drawn near and become intimate with Christ's own. At least that's what our tradition teaches. That insofar as we fulfill the image of Christ in us, we participate more thoroughly in the truth. Now, just 2 more notes before we get into the reading. This work is cast as a response. A response. It's very important. Maximus is responding to a request, not begrudgingly, but not willfully. One could say willingly, but in obedience, he has disciplined his will to follow his friend's advice or request. It's a response. It's not an assertion or an apologia. It's not for him. He's not proving something, right? It's a danger when we think I ought to say something so that my voice is the me, look at me. That kind of attitude ruins truth, Maximus says. So it's a response to his friend's request. It's also a response to the gift of creation. The gift of creation and meaning in creation is whole. We don't have to fill it up. We don't have to add to it. The gift is whole. Our question is, how do we respond properly, appropriately, out of our own to the gift of his own, the gift of the divine, the gift of creation and community? The gift is whole. The gift includes our being. So when we respond, we're responding out of what we've been given. We're responding out of the gift we've been given. And the gift we've been given is to be fashioned in the image and likeness of God. Christian tradition often phrases God's love for creation as a kind of response to his creation, as it were, a way of phrasing it. Our learned response to the divine, our response in love, is only meant to emulate what we understand God's response is to his own creation. And so it's not a response of our own purely, it's a response of our own out of his own, right? Or a co-response. It's a circular mutual response. It's not one way, passive and active. These categories don't work as well. And then finally, Maximus's response is phrased, not stated, not argued, phrased. And phrasing, for our purposes here, phrasing means to gather in meaning unto beautiful harmony, to gather these things unto the harmony of beautiful meaning. It's like a musical phrase. A phrase in musical unites disparate notes in a beautiful way. The movement of phrasing is the heart of meaning, according to our tradition. An idea, a concept, a term alone has no meaning. A word alone has no good, bad, God, has no meaning. Only when realized in relationship does something become meaningful and meaningly beautiful for us. And so to phrase means to partake of the beautiful relation of meaning, to clarify the beautiful relation of meaning. And Christian meaning is the logos in all. And that's what Maximus is primarily returning to in this work. How is the logos, the beautiful logos, our logos, everywhere present and in all things? All right. With that in mind, let's turn to the text. Now, we'll read 4 different passages in a row. I'll read 2, and I'll ask David Goa to read 2, please. We'll read them out, we'll listen. I'll offer just a few kind of thoughts on it, not really commentary, but pointing at what might be going on, and we'll hold them in mind, right? So note them in your book, note the passages. If you've already read through and underlined or made a note, pay attention to that. It's good to just listen, to hear Maximus for a while, to attend, just to try to attend to what he's saying, not with any purpose, just to dwell with. And experience shows when we do that, it is really, really important. All right. First, please turn to page 50. I'm going to read the end of the preface, of Maximus's preface, when he talks about languages of being and non-being and positive and negative, apophatic, cataphatic, because this will give us some tools or some ways to proceed with our conversation this week. Halfway down page 50, I'll read to the end, offer a few thoughts, and move on to the next one. Let God be the guide of the things that are perceived and spoken. For he is the only mind of those who perceive, and of that which is perceived. And he is the only word of those who speak, and of that which is spoken. He is the life of the living, and of the things that have been endowed with life. On account of the very things that are, and that are becoming, he is the one who is, and the one who becomes all things to all. So on account of the things that are, he is the one who is and the one who becomes. But on account of himself, he neither in any way whatsoever belongs to, nor comes to belong to, the things that are, or that are becoming, whose essence he constitutes. He is by nature in the same class as absolutely nothing of the things that are. And for this reason, he allows us to say rather that he is not, because it is more properly said of him that he transcends being. For it is necessary, if we are to know truly the difference between God and creatures, we must know that the negation of the things that are is the affirmation of the one who transcends being. And the affirmation of the things that are is the negation of the one who transcends being. And both designations can be reverent, contemplated about him, yet neither is possible in a proper sense, proper God's own. I'm speaking of the existence and non-existence of God. Both are possible in a proper sense. On the one hand, it can be affirmed that God is because he is the cause of things that are. And on the other hand, it can be completely negated that God is because of his superiority as cause of the things that are. And again, neither is possible in a proper sense of its own, because neither establishes the very essence and nature of what existence is concerning the one whom we seek. So seeking is not comprehensible. For nothing at all, whether it exists or does not exist, is united with him by nature because he is their cause. Neither any of the things that are and are spoken, nor any of the things that are not and are not spoken, in any way comes near him. For he has an existence that is simple and unknowable and inaccessible to everyone, and that is completely indescribable and beyond every cataphatic and apophatic statement. Now, that's, we hold that in mind. A few thoughts on this. Maximus distinguishes God's actions kind of for our sake and of his own essence. For our sake, it looks this way. Of his own, we have to phrase it this way. He says our knowing is via unequal or non-identical relation, which makes the reciprocity of the relation that much more astonishing and that much more beautiful. And he's phrasing things here. He's phrasing things. He's phrasing things in terms of being. He's phrasing things in terms of non-being. He's phrasing things in terms of beyond being. Now, one question we might ask is, does this, or how does this clarify the logos for us, the horizon of the logos? We might hold that in mind. But I want to note just one other thing, technical thing, as it were, before moving on to the second reading. The language of affirmation and negation and positive and negative here all exist in the cataphatic realm. That distinction he makes at the end. Apophasis is distinct. And we'll get more into this later. But we want to right now be clear that cataphasis is not necessarily linked to positive or affirmation, and apophasis is not necessarily or properly linked to negation or dismissal. Next reading. And here Maximus gets into the subject matter of the work proper. This is just the beginning of section 1, page 51, please. I'm going to read over to page 52 and then skip to page 54 and read a little bit there too. So this is page 51, the beginning of section 1, just following what we read about language. So Maximus has said, these are our parameters. We're careful. Now let's begin our discourse. It's titled, How and in What Mode the Holy Church is the Image and Representation of God. So how and in what tropos is the Holy Church the image or icon? And then the word in Greek is typos, type. It's a recognizable word in the Eastern tradition, but here it's rendered representation. Therefore, as the first point of his contemplation, the Blessed Elder said that the Holy Church bears the representation and image of God because she possesses the same activity, energia, as God's, according to imitation and representation. And then Maximus elaborates this, reading the rest of the paragraph. For as God made all things by his infinite power and brought them into existence, so now he sustains them and draws them together and defines their limits. And he providentially binds the intelligible, noetic, and the sensible, aesthetic, things to one another and to himself. And because he possesses full command of everything around him as their cause, beginning, and end, he makes the things that have been set apart from one another by nature to be the things that have converged with one another by the power of their relationship with him as their beginning. That's nice, huh? And it is by this power that all things are led to an identity of movement and existence that is indistinguishable and without confusion. All things are led to absolutely nothing that is originally and according to a difference of nature and motion, discordant and divided from the things that are. All things have been united with all things without confusion, according to the one irreducible relationship and protection of the only beginning and cause. This relationship nullifies and covers over all individual relationships that are contemplated according to the nature of each of the things that are, not because it corrupts them and destroys them and causes them not to be, not through negation, but because it surpasses and outshines them, just as the totality comes into view rather than its parts, and the cause of the totality itself comes into view rather than the totality. And it is by this relationship that the totality itself and the parts of the totality shine and by nature are, because the parts possess the whole cause, which shines more brilliantly than themselves. That's a lovely phrase, shines more brilliantly than themselves. And just as the sun is more brilliant than the stars in nature and power, so also its appearance covers over them as a cause does its effects. Now, the footnotes explaining Greek words are often helpful. Strange, this last sentence could also read, just as the sun is more brilliant than the stars in nature and power, so also its existence, our translator says. It could mean existence too, eparxis. So appearance or existence, and it's a pretty big difference, but hold them both in mind. So also its existence covers over them as a cause does its effects. And then turn to page 54, please. So we see God gathering the cosmos here, and now we see Christ gathering the human being. Page 54, about 14 lines down, beginning in his infinite wisdom. Almost 50% through that first paragraph. Actually, pardon me, beginning just the previous phrase. But Christ is all in all. Maximus continues. In his infinite wisdom, he encloses all things in himself, according to the one simple power of goodness, just as a center defines the lines that originate straight from it. According to the one simple and single cause and power, he does not permit the principles of the things that are to depart from their boundaries, but he limits their extents with a circle. And he leads the distinctions of the things that are and that are becoming by him to himself. He leads them by him to himself, in order that the things created and fashioned by the one God might not be altogether alien to and enemies of one another, since they have no reason and place to demonstrate amicability and peacefulness and identity towards one another, and that they might be safe from their very being changing into non-being, which is separation from God. Non-being is separation from God. That offers a modulation on Maximus's earlier articulation of the languages of being and non-being, and when something is for our sake or is meant to be of God's own. In these passages, first we see the concentration of the divine, the gathering into one of the divine, the gathering of the cosmos as one into the divine. And in this first paragraph, or first section rather, Maximus clarifies relation, good, holy, spiritual relation, but he also begins to clarify possible errors of relation. So he says, this is what relation means, but here, and hence the technical language, he says we have to be careful when we think of distinction, division, relation, reconciliation, confusion. Very careful. Here, Maximus is pointing to how something both is and more than is. The language of apophasis is the language of is and the more than is. And he says, with the divine, we become more than we are, more beautiful than we are. We shine more brightly than we are. And it's also a brief indication of how God and Christ are as one, at one with the church. So this is our first entrance into Maximus's sometimes involved language of drawing things together, drawing near. Now, David, if you wouldn't mind, let's turn to the third reading, and this will be on page 53, please. Beginning the first full paragraph, it will be shown just over the first half dozen lines on page 54, finishing with the sentence, undivided grace and power of the faith. Please, if you wouldn't mind, let's listen to this passage now.
It will be shown that the Holy Church of God works the same things and in the same way as God does around us, as an image relates to its archetype. For from among men, women, and children, nearly boundless in number, who are many in race and class and nation and language and occupation and age and persuasion and trade and manners and customs and pursuits. And again, those who are divided and most different from one another in expertise and worth and fortune and features and habits, those who are in the Holy Church and are regenerated by her and are recreated by the Spirit. To all he gives equally and grants freely one divine form and designation. That is to be and to be called from Christ. And he gives according to faith the one simple, indivisible, and undivided relationship, which does not allow the many and unspeakable differences about each other, even if they exist, to be known on account of the universal reference and union of all the people in the church. According to this union, absolutely no one is separated by himself, herself, from the community, because everyone has grown together and been joined to one another according to one simple and undivided grace and power of the faith.
Thank you, David. Again, not to comment, but just to note a few markers. We want to hold each of these in our minds. Here we see how humanity is gathered unto Christ. We see the divine trope, the divine mode or form or way of being of Christ. We also have the language of participation and regeneration and recreation in here. These are not metaphors for Maximus. And then finally, twice in this passage, Maximus links simplicity and oneness, or the one. And this will matter more as we go on, but we're going to want to hold the simple and the one, or simplicity and oneness together over the week. So we have 3 acts of concentration. So, David, if you wouldn't mind now, please, let's turn to page 58. This will be the last reading. And then we'll pose some questions and we'll begin speaking with each other. 58, please read the whole of section 4.
So section 4, how and in what mode the Holy Church of God symbolically images a human being, and as a human being is imaged by a human being. And again, according to another mode of this contemplation, he said that the Holy Church of God is a human being which has the sanctuary as its soul, the divine altar as its mind, and the nave as its body. And therefore the church is as the image and likeness of a human being who was made according to the image and likeness of God. The church sets forth moral discipline through the nave as through the body, and spiritually interprets natural contemplation through the sanctuary as through the soul, and reveals mystical theology through the divine altar as through the mind. And conversely, he said that man, the human nature, is a mystical church. Through the body as through the nave, man virtuously cleanses the practical part of the soul by the outworking of the commandments according to moral discipline. Through the soul as through the sanctuary, man, the human nature, brings to God through reason the principles according to sense perception that have been circumscribed of matter purely, and by the Spirit according to natural contemplation. And through the mind, as through the altar, man summons by means of another kind of silence, one that is composed of many syllables and notes, the oft sung silence in the inner sanctuaries of the unseen and unknowable majestic voice of divinity. And in as far as it is possible for man, he becomes acquainted with the silence according to mystical theology, and becomes such as one who has been made worthy of the visitation of God ought to be, and is imprinted with his radiant splendor.
Thank you, David. What do we see here? Briefly. We were reading just prior to this, Maximus's linking of the church with the cosmos, and then the cosmos with Christ. Now the church with the human being, or the anthropos. Here we see how the energy, the energia of the logos permeates our being. Maximus is talking about our being here, our person here. It's also a fine articulation or kind of gesturing towards intimacy with the divine. One has to only kind of glance at this kind of thing. It's very dangerous to draw too close before our time. But Maximus here is conveying something, I think, of the intimacy with the divine. He is also saying, and this is the most important part for us, he's also phrasing the silence, which is also part of the logos. The silence, which is also part of the logos. Right. Having gathered these things, let's pose 3 questions, please. They're in the chat too, and like I said before, I will send these out the day before, usually, to give us some time. But let me pose them now, and I'll pose them, and I'll do a little bit of reasoning. So the first question is, what is the meaning of Maximus's sense of living tradition? What do we understand by living tradition? And the reason this came to mind was, well, because of what he gives us. And then the way he begins by, not with boldness, but by layering himself as a learner. And what is communicated is that tradition is always beyond our comprehension. And we don't mean by that not understandable. We mean if we think we can encompass or exhaust the meaning we're living, then we're in trouble. Instead, the meaning requires continual efforts. But living tradition also has the sense of being unfinished, non-final. I'm not saying not whole or not that a gift isn't whole, but tradition is non-finished. So that's around the idea. Then gathering, the second question, what is gathering? What does gathering mean? And what makes gathering beautiful? This whole work is about gathering in a way, or drawing together, drawing near, unification, community. It's a movement that we're talking about. Gathering is a tropos, a mode or a form. It's not the logos, it's a tropos, right? And I thought, what does gathering assume, either positively or negatively? What does it take on as its a gift? And what might be involved in our negative assumption about gathering? And by that, I mean, if we assume that gathering means that things are broken and ought to be healed only in this way, or if we assume that difference ought to be subsumed under identity, or if we think that as long as this place is revered right over here, then the gathering is finished. What we think we're doing when we're gathering. What's the logic or the rationale involved, the logos involved? I thought, does gathering need a reason? Is gathering holy? But that's not what Christ says. He says, in his name. There must be a for the sake of, a logos that informs that tropos of gathering. And then third, why invoke the parameters of languages of being and non-being? This is Maximus's preface. It's a very well-known passage, and rightly so. It's astonishing what he opens up for us and what is possible to dwell within language and to dwell within silence. But questions of being and non-being or beyond being are questions of categories of meaning. Do we see our categories of meaning to be necessary? And do they have necessary complements, right? If we have being over here, is it necessarily contrasted with non-being? What is assumed? That's the difficulty with the dualistic form of positive negative. And then also, we have languages of being, non-being, beyond being. But Maximus says silence attends the logos too. So let's open up with one of these questions, however we please. We have the text in front of us. We have question of living tradition, gathering, languages of being and non-being. We also just have what we each have brought. Maximus is endlessly fruitful in dialogue. So more will have emerged too. But please, let's begin to talk together. Let's open it up a bit.
I'm struck in all of the readings that you identified, Andrew. I mean, I think of this in the whole book, of course, the whole consideration. That he is both speaking about an initiation and in a way, as best words can do that, um, inviting us into it. Initiation, when we think of that extraordinary word in the Christian tradition, all of the mysteries, in a way, grow out of the kind of primal initiation, which is baptism. And the baptismal font, the baptismal pool, is a tomb and a womb. It also, this primary form of initiation, is always done publicly. And I think that's because it is not simply about the person being baptized. It is about the community and how they see the person who's being baptized and how they understand themselves in relationship to that person and that person's life. So initiation rituals always involve a kind of letting go, a kind of dying to what you presume, and a rebirth, a coming to see the world with new eyes. Coming in, as in several of his readings, he speaks of so beautifully, for me to see that the particularity is not problematic. It's not that these differences shouldn't exist. It's that they aren't the prism through which we should see the world. So the question arises in my mind around all of the questions that you have asked. What is communicated by the living tradition? What does it mean? What does it mean to gather? What makes gathering beautiful? Uh, what's going on when he invokes the language of being and non-being? So, in all of these readings that you've focused our attention on, it seems to me, if I have not misunderstood it, and I would love to hear others on this, that all of them are saying that the living tradition at the heart of this is the grace of communion. At the heart of it is being grasped by the wonder of the life of the world, of another human being. That all gathering is that synergy, that occasion where we experience the energy of God. And the energy of God is communion. That communion is beauty. It is that way, as you have highlighted in your thinking about the intellect as nous and the sensibilities as aesthetic. It is that moment where these two dance together, where they are one with each other. And so, to your last question about the parameters of the language of being and non being, and we see this in Maximus so often in the careful way, in that utterly remarkable reading at the end of the opening of the text, uh, which is really on the sort of on the apophatic and the cataphatic. That the the only way we the only way we really dwell in being is also in our becoming. They're not. There isn't something static here. It's alive. It's a grace. It's unfolding. And non-being is all those tragic, I guess I'll use that word, tragic moments in our life when we are not in communion, when we are in presumption, when we are looking at something, when we are not attentive to the logoi that dwells in all things, through the logos that pulls all of it together and makes it all whole. So these texts that you focused on, my sense is at the heart of them, he's saying, and he doesn't really, I don't know quite how to put this. He's really inviting us to see the heart of the matter. And of course, the mystery of the church isn't something that the church possesses. It is something that the church is meant to be. The church is when it is the church, which is communion. It is communion. Where communion is, then, can we say the church is? Where communion is not, the church is not. Communion is the church, the human being is the church, the cosmos is the church, when communion is there. And that's when it's real. That's when being and becoming are dancing together. And anything else is in the darkness. In any case, an initial thought.
Let me pull your coattail and ask you to follow up a little bit, David, because you've opened up something interesting here. The idea of wholeness in the gathering. It's part of what was meant in the question. Do we negatively assume that something isn't whole until it's gathered? But as you said, and as Maximus articulates well, the Christian tradition teaches that the particularity of being a person, of being a human being, is we're created whole in the image. When we gather, it's wholeness coming into communion. Or is that not the way to think of it? What's the movement between them? What's involved in the gathering? Does it change our being? We enter into communion. We're created to be beings in communion. When we're not in communion, we're in non-being, as you put well, as Maximus puts. And yet when we meet another person, we see them as Christ, not as not whole. We seek to see the image of Christ, or the life of Christ in them. So how does wholeness, in your understanding, and we can open up on this, how does wholeness relate to particularity then? Particularity is fulfilled in communion.
Well, wholeness and holiness are the same thing. They're not finished. They aren't something. And I mean, I think that's central. We have a habit of thinking, I suppose these days we think in the language of authenticity and drawing parameters around identity. But within the church, holiness isn't something. It is a gift of being in communion with the other, the holy other God, and through the holy other God with our neighbor and our deepest self. So I think one of the areas where this is sometimes misunderstood is we tend to think of wholeness as something instead of the place of the energy of God. Does that speak to it?
That's nicely put. And Maximus returns to these things as we go on, but that's a very nice foundation on which to begin to think about this.
I have a question related to this. In the third passage that we read, Maximus talks about there being an archetype for the church. So I was wondering what the implications of that are. What does it mean to have? It means that there's something beyond the church, or at least the church defined in a certain way. Perhaps the church defined in a parochial way. There's something beyond that. And David, you said that wherever there is communion, there is the church. So I'm wondering, and in that third passage that we read, it also talks about we are all one in the church. Are we also one outside the church, if church is defined narrowly or parochially, denominationally. So these are some of the questions that are running through my mind.
Let's clarify a couple of things, and then hand it to you, David, or to another. In the first part of that, on page 53, turn to page 53. The Holy Church of God works the same things and in the same way as God does around us. So this is about the church as a kind of, as one with God. So the work of the church and the work of God around us, we understand that to be as an image relates to its archetype. Image and archetype are words which are not meant to be derivative or lesser in the sense of untrue or insubstantial. I think it's a way of saying a different way of putting it than original and copy, or presence and representation, or events and replication. It's not something again, or that's a diminished form of it. It is as one. First, and then second of all, church in Maximus says he wouldn't understand the term narrow or parochial or denominational. Those are our terms. And so he's speaking in a kind of simple way, which is expansive. He also in this volume refers to, he's got a phrase like the church not made by hands. So he refers to the kind of liturgy of the whole of creation. So church is not delimited. I mean, his whole point is to find its echoes in the divine, human being, in creation, in our forms of meaning. So just before we go on, that's also here too. It's a good question because, especially from our point of view, it does seem like one begins to wonder if the gathering does have a center, or if it's just everybody, anything, here we are. And it's not that, but it's not, let's say, it's not meant to be some kind of tyrannical acceptance either. It's neither one of those. It's neither my way or murder or anything goes. Somewhere in between.
If I can pitch in on this just a little bit to the text that you mentioned, where it says on 53, as an image relates to its archetype. You can think of that as an icon that is as the human person, who is the image of God, the icon of God, relates to the archetype, relates to the icon of God, of which we are an icon of. Jesus Christ is our icon of God. Jesus Christ is the fullest image we have of God in the Christian tradition. And the human being is an icon of the icon of God. We're an image of Christ. As to the other issue that you point to, Glenn, I was thinking as you raised it, what must have been in Maximus's mind when he's thinking about these things? Here is a person who is arrested by the emperors, arrested by his bishops, who is chased all over Hell's Half Acre most of his life. He lives a long life, most of it in exile or in some form of confinement. It strikes me as a real blessing to us because we have his work because of it. It makes one think that there's a real gift to the martyrs' church. But he's being martyred by his own people. We have to remember this. So what's he pointing to? He's obviously not pointing to the church. I mean, he knows in his body, it's imprinted on him at the end of his life. he loses his tongue and he loses his hand. They kill him, ostensibly. He knows in his bones that the church, the ecclesia, the gathering, that's what the word means. It means gathering, isn't some fixed matter. Its heart is a presence. Its heart is the presence of the mystery of God between us. Its heart is communion. So reading him, I hadn't really thought about this before, reading him around these passages and thinking about how he's thinking about the church. So I really appreciate your question. Really highlights for me what his own existential condition was, historical condition was. And this is also the context in which he's pointing to this. And I think this is why he sees so clearly the church, the mystery of the church is the grace-given gift of communion in the life of the world. One further thing about it in the iconographic tradition, going as back as far as we can go, you will often see the mountains in the background rising up. You know, it comes from the Psalms and from the prophets, the prophetic literature. The mountains are rising up in praise of God, in delight in creation. But this is the tradition's way of saying communion is not the captive of any part of creation. It's the essence of all of creation. All of creation is the dance of delight. And where that is not, something that doesn't exist is modeled, which is non-being, alienation. We say it has no essence. That's it. It is not. So that's why Jesus Christ in the incarnation comes on a healing mission into the world to heal that, to restore communion where that which does not exist colonizes everything. It's also with Maximus interesting that he, you know, he's one of the church fathers that both wrote in Greek and Latin, and was, of course, executed by his own church. I mean, if we want to speak of church in that institutional sense, where he was himself, because, of course, the divisions between East and West were not in any way reified at that point. And he and the Pope were exiled together. And the church wasn't in any way divided, except kind of locally and regionally. There were all kinds of divisions because politics is everywhere. But we hadn't gotten to the place where the East and the West were kind of defining themselves against each other. So it's, but it's worth taking note of the fact that he is also thinking about the church out of this context. So the particular and the institutional form of the church, it's not that that doesn't count. And I'm not trying to take anything away from that. That's awfully significant. But it's secondary world to what the mystery is. And I think that needs to be the foundation upon which we think about the other aspects of it.
Thank you.
But what do you think? I mean, go further with it.
Well, I'm I'm just thinking about how far the church or the churches in the history of Christianity have fallen from that archetype. um, and of course, we use the literal the communion service to exclude people who aren't baptized, or at least some denominations do. So there are some people who are allowed to participate in communion, and there are some people who are not. And so I'm wondering if the communion includes non-Christians, for example, and how Maximus would feel about that.
Well, I'll just say a little bit about this, um, out of my own sense of it, and
Mm-hmm.
make of that what you wish. Um, the church has disciplines. These disciplines are there, as he has already hinted at in some of what we've read today. Disciplines about the body, about the soul, about the mind. Um, and these disciplines are there to help deepen our initiation. That is, deepen our drawing near to God and to our neighbor and to the wonderful life of the world. So communion within the church, the mystery of Holy Communion in the church, is of course um, a discipline. Uh, it does not colonize communion. I mean, communion exists far beyond that, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
discipline about that. And one of the things that has struck me, even relatively recently in the last few years of my life, is in my uh, church how we, we, I think there is a bit of a habit of thinking that you are going to communion yourself. Because also within the Christian East, we have a set of disciplines, including confession, um, in which we see it as and fasting as preparations for Holy Communion. And those disciplines are, I think, they're wonderful disciplines and exceedingly helpful to many. But it can give us the notion that somehow we go to communion ourselves, but we're in the ecclesia. It's a gathering. We're not going to communion ourselves. We are together in communion. And we aren't in communion when we take the body and blood of our Lord into ourselves. The whole of the liturgia is communion. The whole of it is toward communion, an embodiment of communion, a bringing into communion of all of life. That's why we begin the liturgy with these latias that gather up the world. So when we speak of the gathering, as Andrew did at the beginning here, and as he framed as a central theme, gathering and concentration, well, what's the liturgy doing? Yeah, it's gathering and concentrating. We gather up the world for those who travel by air and by sea, for those who are sick and suffering, for the king and civil authorities. We gather up the world. We gather them before the mercy seat of Christ. We gather them before us so we can contemplate whether or not we are disposed to communion, or whether those matters are a source of alienation, a source of non-being for us. And so we have to think of this, I think, directly to your question about a discipline. Communion is within given churches is a discipline. I think it is a tragedy when people assume that the discipline's the point. You know, that's, as the old Zen koan used to say, don't look at the finger, look at the moon. But at the same time, that doesn't mean the discipline isn't significant. It's absolutely significant, because it is a cultivation of a capacity. And that's significant. But just to accent one more time, when I am, and again, this is, I have no idea what Maximus would actually say about this, but when I am in the liturgy, and for one reason or another, I do not go to receive communion, I am in communion. And others receive it with me and for me. And my own sense is, so we become, I think we become very concerned in our world, particularly through very good work in the ecumenical movement, which really counts. But we've become a little bit, I think, fixated on thinking of communion as instrumental. And I don't think this is what Maximus is talking about at all.
Mm.
This is, so when I've been teaching at Newman, for example, there's liturgy regularly at Newman, the Catholic school here. And it's beautifully done. It's simple, it's singular, it's quiet, it's deeply prayerful. And I mean, I know that I worship in the Orthodox Church. So in some sense, that the Catholic communion is formally for Catholics. I think that's wonderful. I don't feel excluded. I don't feel like I'm not in communion. I mean, is it full? There's all kinds of technical issues here, but
Mm.
those are all secondary. To be in the presence of people going and receiving the body and blood of Christ, because we always receive that on behalf of the life of the world. It's on behalf of the life of the world. And that's just a joy to me. Just a joy. And in those times when I felt I've been in a state of spiritual difficulty and was not really prepared to go to communion, and there are issues here as well, and others were going, my sadness, my struggle experiences the oil of gladness of their communion. That is a gift beyond measure.
Mm.
Just as when I see people go to confession, I experience their humanity, which cleanses my mind of who I presume them to be. That is a gift. So the mystery is not a secret, it's a wonder. and that communion is everywhere present and filleth all things. Well, I'm sorry for going on about this.
No, that's
I hope it's helpful.
it's beautiful. I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, at the heart of the teaching isn't identity, it's joy.
Yeah.
Being in joy with each other. Beginning with ourselves and then wondering, why not me? The modern form of identity. It's very strange and a kind of deformation of personhood, Maximus would say, or as it came out in David's. But the movement of that question, that impulse is holy, is good. We are going to return to gathering, to images, to icons tomorrow, and to symbol. So why don't we hold these in mind for now and draw to a close here?